This week, as a Jewish news podcast based in the US, there's currently no bigger news story than the national presidential election and elections for Congress happening the week of November 3rd. So let's take a moment and talk about where we stand right now with elections generally and the Jewish vote specifically. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So just to be clear, this is not a super in-depth, nitty-gritty look at all aspects of the election, because that would fill up a lot of time, and there are, I would argue, much better resources for those of us obsessed with analyzing every detail. What this is a general overview more geared to planting a flag and saying, okay, this is where we're at, for people who maybe don't spend all day on Twitter. And the first thing to talk about, being a Jewish news podcast and all, is the Jewish vote. I actually covered what to expect of the Jewish vote back in February in the before times, if you want to go back and listen to episode 20 of this podcast. But most of what that boiled down to is a pretty basic trend. In presidential elections, Jews tend to vote overwhelmingly for Democrats and not Republicans, by margins of around 70% Democrat and 25% Republican. And judging by a newly released American Jewish Committee national poll of over 1,300 Jewish respondents, that trend is sticking around for this election too. Keeping in mind that the margin of error for this poll is 4.2 percentage points, in response to the question, quote, if the presidential election were held today, for whom would you most likely vote? 75% of the Jews said they would vote for Democratic nominee Joe Biden, and 22% said they would vote for Republican nominee Donald Trump. This is, in some ways, extra interesting, given that Trump has made Israel central to his election campaigns and his presidency, and for a while, especially early in 2020, Republicans had a whole spiel going about how, there's this, quote, Jexit, or the Jewish exit, from the Democratic Party. Another poll from early September of 810 Jewish voters, run by the Jewish Electorate Institute, which, side note, yes, this is a real institute, and that's kind of cool, right? Anyway, this poll shines a light on, again, why Jexit just isn't a thing. When Jewish voters were asked to rate their priorities, the top three were the economy, healthcare, and the coronavirus response. Anti-Semitism came in fifth. In 11th place, last among 11 different priorities, was 64% of Jewish voters saying Israel was one of the most or a very important priority. And just to take a step back before anyone flips out about American Jewish support for Israel, other polling shows that consistently, nearly 9 in 10 Jewish Republicans and nearly 9 in 10 Jewish Democrats consider themselves to be pro-Israel. So what this tells us is, again, something really basic. Most Jewish voters vote because of domestic issues and are not single-issue Israel voters. So no matter what Trump or Republicans say, because their domestic policies just don't align with the opinion of most Jews, there's no sweeping exit of Jews from the Democratic Party. It just is not happening. It should be said, however, that this looks very different when you zoom into Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities, who, depending on what poll you look at and who you want to trust, are anywhere from 70 to 80% roughly pro-Trump. So kind of the inverse of what the trend is for American Jews as a whole. And when it comes to Orthodox communities, Israel is also much more of a central priority when voting, and a perception that Trump has been the best president for Israel ever feeds into that. Now, before we move on, it's important to take all of this polling with a grain of salt, even if it does show a consistent snapshot of the Jewish vote. And that grain of salt goes for all polling, by the way, just as a sort of coverall disclaimer for the rest of this podcast. So coming back to the Jewish vote, part of what I said back in February on this podcast was that the Jewish vote basically didn't matter, because even with the clear trends of mostly voting with the Democratic Party, there just aren't enough Jews in the US to make any significant difference. And by doesn't matter, I mean in the sense of putting so much emphasis on the Jewish vote by either Republicans or Democrats. I do still stand by that interpretation of population and voting data, but it would be inappropriate of me to leave out the possibility that, in some places, the Jewish vote may actually be really key next week. And in saying this, I'm leaning on an article published through Brandeis University by affiliated researchers that you can find in the podcast notes if you want to check it out yourself. But really, what the article boils down to is the fact that certain states might be won by very narrow margins, and when you've got very narrow margins, even a group that's a tiny percentage of the population can have a big effect on the outcome. One of the examples is Michigan, which Trump won in 2016 by less than 11,000 votes. And according to Brandeis researchers, Michigan has roughly 107,000 Jewish adults living there. So theoretically, if 11,000 more Clinton-supporting Jewish voters showed up in 2016, Trump would have lost the state. Now, let's just be clear, this is not all on the Jews. If 11,000 more Clinton-supporting voters from any background showed up, Trump would have also lost Michigan. And you can just as easily have all the Jewish adults or nearly all of the Jewish adults vote and still have a narrow margin between candidates depending on how many people overall have voted. But the point here is, I think, still relevant and interesting, that there may be certain states where the Jewish vote can make a huge difference. Though we be small, we may yet be mighty. Also, please don't take my skepticism of the impact of the Jewish vote to mean that people shouldn't vote. God forbid. Please vote. If you haven't yet, there's still time to figure out how. I do believe every vote matters, but I also think we need to stay measured about the Jewish vote in a political cycle where it seems like there's always an outsized conversation about the Jewish vote specifically. Having covered all that, let's step into the world of polling for the elections overall. Again, not a super deep dive, just a this is where we're at look at things. And I'll be going by polling analysis done by 538, which is a data-focused reporting crew affiliated with ABC News. The reason I tend to go by 538's analysis is that they aggregate lots of different polls that happen all across the country, weigh them by quality, and combine all of that info into a more reliable polling analysis because it's not just pulling from one thing. So when it comes to the presidential election, Biden is currently leading to be the next president of the United States. 538's weighted average has roughly 52% of voters likely to vote for Biden versus 43% for Trump. There's a link in the podcast notes where you can check that out, but you can also check polling for individual states. And in Minnesota, Biden has a similar lead at roughly 50% versus Trump's 42%. As before, and I cannot stress this enough, grain of salt with all of this. I was convinced in 2016 that Hillary Clinton was going to easily beat Trump, in part because of polling that I saw. Trump still has a path to an electoral victory in 2020, even without the popular vote, just like in 2016. The other big thing to watch for in the elections is the Senate, which is currently controlled by Republicans who have 53 of the 100 seats. There are a lot of Senate elections happening this time around, and 538 calculates that there's a 77% chance that Democrats win enough seats to gain control of the Senate in this next election. And just to state the obvious, the reason this is a big deal is that the Republican-controlled Senate has been key to Republican power over the past couple of years. If the Senate was controlled by Democrats, for example, President Trump most likely would have been impeached and thrown out of office earlier this year. As to the House of Representatives, there are some high-profile races happening, but on the whole, 538 projects a 98% chance that the House remains in Democratic control. So the most likely, but by no means guaranteed scenario after next week is Joe Biden as president and a Democratic-controlled House and Senate. Again, this is judging by the polling. Ultimately, nothing happens until it happens, and it's a toss-up until somebody wins. Or at least, that's the attitude that's keeping me afloat. So, vote if you haven't yet. Cannot repeat that enough. And to leave off on some maybe obvious but very necessary reminders, there most likely will not be a guaranteed winner in any of the elections on the night of November 3rd. We're used to Election Day giving us the voting and the results by nighttime of the same day. With a pandemic and record absentee ballot voting, and some states counting absentee ballots that are received up to a week after Election Day, and other states still engaged in lawsuits about up to when they can count the absentee ballots, this is a process that's going to take a while. For Minnesotans who remember this, I'm thinking of kind of the whole Al Franken, Norm Coleman drama over a decade ago, where the race to be a senator for Minnesota was so close, there was a huge recount of votes that took months. I don't know if this time around we're going to have to wait months, but I do know that personally, I'm going to be spending this upcoming Tuesday avoiding everything to do with elections because I'm just not really going to trust any result for probably the next 2 weeks at minimum. And the really important thing to remember is that if there are going to be any major disinformation campaigns by malicious foreign countries or anyone else, with all of the uncertainty in the air and questions about the legitimacy of our voting process, the next 2 weeks are likely to hold the worst of conspiracy theories, misinformation, and disinformation. And that's not even touching on how many of the current conspiracies are homegrown American crap, just to be completely blunt, spread by President Trump himself. So be extra careful with the news you consume, the rumors you hear, what comes across your Facebook feed, and any election results you might see next week. I'll also just be entirely honest. This feels like we're sort of standing at the edge of a cliff, looking into the void of whatever may come. And it's really stressful. There's a lot riding on this election cycle for every voter and every party, and we've seen that violence can erupt at a moment's notice, particularly from white supremacist militia groups who support Trump. And I don't want to get into fear-mongering, but I think it's sort of objectively true that many people and many Jews are seriously afraid of what may come. Now, I can't really offer any warm and hopeful words to address that feeling. Some days I don't even believe in warm and hopeful words. But I'll fall back on what I consider a basic fact of history that I think I've mentioned before on this podcast. No matter what happens, we will come out the other side. If there's anything to be learned from Jewish history, it's that we keep going, and if things look bad, we just have to build something better along the way. So if you can, find a moment to let yourself relax with some guilty pleasures, a rom-com, some wine, whatever it is that calms you down. Practice the self-care, and I guess I'll see you with the next episode of this podcast on the other side. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.